name is Mathieu. I'm a postdoc at Shape Lab in Stanford University, and the work I'm going to present today is called Robotic Assemblies of Haptic Proxy Objects for Tangible Interaction in Virtual Reality. And I'm presenting this paper on behalf of Yiwei Zhao, our master student, who sadly couldn't join us today, mainly because of visa reasons. So over the past decades, we've seen that virtual reality has been becoming more accessible and more affordable to the general public while providing more immersive and engaging user experiences. And so we can see here that people can now play in virtual worlds, interact with many different virtual objects and throw them and do a bunch of stuff with them. And virtual reality is indeed really interesting in the sense that it offers great advantages with regard to interaction, as we can interact with the virtual world the same way we interact in the physical world using our hands. But the remaining issue is that these manipulations are performed in mid-air, and we cannot feel physically the physical objects, the virtual objects that we are actually manipulating. But our hands offer an incredible potential for manipulation and interaction, and haptic feedback and tangible interaction remain a key part of our daily experience of the physical world. So haptics researchers have explored mainly two different approaches to provide haptic feedback to manipulate digital objects. So the first one on the right is called kinesthetic force feedback, and allows to recreate sensations such as inertia, damping, stiffness, while the tactile feedback on the right, relies on the precise mechanoreceptors located in the skin to capture finer sensations such as texture, temperature, or pressure. But to the best of our knowledge, none has yet been able to combine and emulate all the sensations of touch within one single device. In the meantime, encounter type haptics, using physical props to embody virtual objects and facilitate manipulation, provide accurate kinesthetic and tactile feedback. But these physical props are static and cannot change shape to match the virtual objects that we're manipulating in the virtual world, and thus require a large collection of physical objects to be able to face all the different possible situations that could be actually encountered in the virtual world. So how could we obtain these physical proxy objects on demand as we manipulate the virtual world? So one simple way would just be to 3D print objects on demand, but this remains too slow for user interaction, and especially doesn't provide interactive objects. So another approach would be to use shape-changing interfaces as they allow to create 2.5D shapes as runtime. But the main problem remains that the objects that are created are grounded by the device and do not allow rich hand manipulations in space. So another approach consists in assembling structures automatically by combining simple objects together, either using self-assembly systems on the left here, or collaborative systems. And so we see great potential using robotic assembly systems to provide seamless user experiences in VR. And we propose to combine both approaches to create robotic assembly systems at runtime and at low resolution to create haptic proxy objects for tangible interaction in virtual reality. We created this proof of concept, a system capable of building haptic proxy objects on any horizontal surface using magnetic building blocks. These building blocks are created by actuated by small robots to create rich and diverse haptic proxy objects supporting rich manipulations in VR, as well as supporting interactive capabilities. But new challenges emerge as we consider haptic proxy objects for virtual reality. So an optimal assembly system should allow fast assemblies to support uninterrupted and seamless interaction in VR, as well as fine spatial resolution to allow virtual objects and haptic proxy objects to match with sufficient identifiable features. The system should be modular to leverage reusable elements in order to keep the size of the overall system adapted to the application, and scalable to support diverse objects without hindering the overall performances of the users and the system. And the resulting object should be untethered and should afford unrestricted hand manipulation in the physical world. And the thing is, some of these goals still remain unachievable due to technical limitations. And as such, this work is our attempt to tackle these challenges, contributing with the proof of concept of a self-assembly system for tangible interaction in VR, 2 different approaches to assemble haptic proxy objects with robots, and a technical evaluation of these 2 approaches. We used Zooids, our robotic platform, for we used Zooids as our base robotic system for our assembling platform. So Zooids can be controlled by a central server using radio communication and as they report their position and orientation using high-speed light pattern for optical tracking. The first assembly method that we developed was using active building blocks, each capable of moving by themselves on any horizontal surface. Each active block is composed of a Zooid on top of which sits an actual building block. So this one has permanent magnets distributed all around its outer surface, allowing blocks to magnetically bind together. And as moving blocks constitute obstacles for each other when they assemble, we need to coordinate their motion to optimize both assembly time while maximizing the success rate of the assembly. And for this, each block trying to reach its destination first comes closer to its destination and then adjusts its orientation. It finally slides into position and snaps magnetically with the rest of the assembly. But to avoid what we called this situation, our gaps, that is highly failure prone, where when the one block has to come and fit in between 2 others, we assembled the object from the center of the object, and we let it go outwards by assembling blocks one after another in a clockwise spiral. And so this method allows us to assemble pretty much any haptic proxy object that we interact with. But so while this works for one single layer, can we build something that would be a bit more complex, actually? And so using ramps, for instance, in that case actuated by 2 other robots, we allow building blocks to come and sit on top of each other to create multi-layers assemblies. The second approach used passive blocks, so essentially empty shells, the same shells, but completely empty. And we use one single robot, or like multiple robots, but dedicated ones, to move these blocks around, mainly to optimize the number of technological elements that we would have in the system for simplicity, while providing more diversity in the overall building block design. So we used multiple different types of blocks in this method. So the first one, movers, like the active blocks, contain one Zooid on top of which sits a magnetic case that allows to attach and carry the other passive blocks around. These passive blocks can be of different shapes and heights. They also have permanent magnets distributed around their outer surface that allows them to snap together and can be coupled with a bunch of different magnetic interchangeable tops that snap magnetically as well. And so as the mover comes and pick up the block, they snap magnetically together, and the misaligned magnets allow to lift one side of the block. The mover can then move the block around more easily, and as it comes and snaps in the rest of the assembly, the magnetic force lays the block down on the surface and allows the mover to disconnect and move on and go fetch another block. And so in this assembly method, we start from a corner and we build the object layering outwards by assembling columns afterwards like that. And so this allows mover to disconnect from passive objects easily, passive blocks easily, while minimizing the narrow gap, the difficult situation that we talked about before. And if the mover happen to fail to disconnect, it is just going to wait for a little bit, as other blocks tend to create vibration that help the mover to disconnect, and if not, it remains in the assembly as considered as a passive block. Sorry. And so we included in these assemblies then tracking optical trackers that can be that allow the haptic proxy object to be tracked in space using standard motion capture systems. Haptic proxy objects can then be manipulated to reflect 3D objects in VR, allowing users to perform simple interactions, in that case, just like pointing and touching the object in the virtual world. But haptic proxy objects can also be used as input devices to draw in space simple things, for instance, or to create custom controllers for video games. While not limited in the physical world, the motion can be constrained in the virtual world to allow to create motion illusion and guide users to perform specific actions. In that case, controlling the brightness of the light just using the vertical motion of the handle. And combinations of trackable blocks allow to create interactive features, such as here a thumb switch that the user can push and flick like that to control the lightsaber in the virtual world. So we conducted technical evaluation to measure the overall performances of our assembly method. We had the system assemble a basic rectangle using 6 different, 6 active blocks actually. And so the result shows a linear correlation between the number of blocks in the assembly and the overall assembly time, where like each block required about 3 seconds. And this method showed a high successful rate overall. On the other hand, we had the passive method performing exactly the same assembly using 2 or 3, respectively 2 and 3 assembling robots. But as we can see here, the performances are much lower, and so the assembly of each block required about like between 9 and 12 seconds to be put in the assembly. And we also see a nonlinear correlation between the number of blocks and the overall time, and this was mainly due to the turn-by-turn paralleling assembly. So each couple of assembling robot had to go fetch each time passive blocks, and so if the overall number of block was odd, both of them had to go back and fetch a new one. So like increasing the overall assembling time. And so the other thing that we can see is the successful rate is like significantly lower in that case, and so that mainly comes from the difficulty that Zooids had to move the blocks around actually. As it did modify the local control system, and due to the Zooids actually, due to their low positioning accuracy, this often led to misplacements of stuck situations, decreasing the overall successful rate of the system. So now let's look back at the goals that we identified a bit earlier to build an optimal haptic proxy object system. So we saw that the blocks we use in both methods allow to create diverse haptic proxy objects, but still assemblies have to be manually disassembled to allow blocks to be reused for more objects, limiting the overall modularity of the system. So using electromagnets, for instance, just like Robot Pebble, would allow us to control the magnetic bond between all the different blocks, and would allow us then to support automatic disassembly, so the objects could like fall apart and could recreate another objects on the fly like that. The technical evaluation revealed also that the speed and reliability remain limiting factors for seamless interaction in VR using our assembly system. So using an external system instead of Zooids could actually improve the overall assembly systems, the overall assembling performances, while providing more, potentially more stability and more reliability. And finally, the resolution of our assembly remain kind of coarse limited both by the size of the Zooids and the size of our building blocks. And so to improve this resolution, one thing that we could do is just use smaller blocks typically. But performances would just like drop with that, as we would have like so many more blocks to assemble and more traverse to do and everything. And so an alternative direction that we started to explore is to leverage haptic retargeting, so providing to allow to provide higher resolution sensations by wrapping the space around the object and displacing the hand in the virtual world accordingly, for instance, using techniques like scaling up and curvature alteration. So to wrap up, we presented today a proof of concept of a robotic assembly system for haptic proxy objects to support tangible interaction in virtual reality. We then introduced two methods and their respective performance evaluations. While imperfect, we believe that this early work shows potential for future research to explore new ways to provide better haptic feedback in virtual reality. Thank you very much, and I will now be happy to take your questions.
We have some time for a couple of quick questions.
Hello, Fabrice Michulik, Preferred Networks. So this is very cool stuff. I was just wondering why, so the purpose of having self-assembling blocks for the purpose of proxy objects, how does that compare to just assembling the blocks yourself? Since you have a user and just a couple of blocks, why wouldn't something like a Lego-like system where you just assemble your proxy object wouldn't be more efficient? You could also have smaller objects as well. Why do you actually need that kind of robotic self-assembling contraption?
Because it's cool. No, mainly, so the thing that you saw was that people and users mainly wear HMDs to interact in VR, and so cannot see. They would, for transparency purposes, you don't want to like take off your HMD and have your Legos to assemble on the side and put them together and then put back your HMD. Continue interacting in VR. So the goal it's still early work, and we need to like improve the scale of the objects that we can assemble as well as the finesse of it. But essentially, the goal would be to assemble these objects as you're interacting in VR. So you don't know what is happening. The robots are just assembling the things, the objects that you need actually on the side, and they come within reach, within your line of sight in the virtual world as you actually need them. Exactly. Yeah.
Hi, John McClelland, Carleton University. I think this is really cool work, and I'd probably like to talk to you a bit more after the talk. But I'm wondering, a big problem I see with passive haptics in virtual reality is transitioning between objects. And for switching out physical proxies, it seems like, at least at this point, you may still have a problem with switching those. So I was wondering where you might see kind of making the transition between objects smoother in the future, assuming you will continue this research.
So the blocks that we've been using, the ones that you saw in this work, were just like simple, like blocks, like Legos typically. And so these don't change shape; they're just static. And so one thing that we thought about exploring was to like combine these blocks with shape-changing technologies. So using shape memory alloys, for instance, or all the work that has been done by like Anrudo, for instance, or Lining Yao from MIT, and so combining these things with these passive blocks to have each block capable of changing slightly its shape, but then we would be able to create assemblies that would actually could evolve in shape through time actually in the assemblies, and so we see potential for that to create like an even more seamless user experience in VR, manipulating these objects.
Great. So do I.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's So thank you, speaker again.